I then ended up in Egypt, where I was 22, 23, and arrested and convicted for 5 years, and served my time. In Egypt, you serve 3/4 of your sentence, so I should have been released after 3 years and 9 months. I served 4 because it took them that long to get the paperwork done. And they didn't release Egyptians even if they finished their sentence, I can assure you. And so then I came back to the UK on the 1st of March 2006. I was in the leadership committee of Hizb-ut-Tahrir at the time, throughout 2006. But I no longer believed in these ideas. And how that happened was that my time in prison, the 4 years in prison, 2 things happened. One is I was adopted by Amnesty International in the prison of conscience. So Amnesty stood on principle, knowing that I despised everything they stood for, because we weren't, and Hizb-ut-Tahrir aren't directly a terrorist organisation, they're an extremist organisation, looking for a violent state to establish. Amnesty said, right, these guys have been convicted for their beliefs, whether we agree or disagree with them. And they don't deserve torture, and they definitely don't deserve five years for ideas that we simply don't agree with. So we're going to adopt them as prisoners of conscience. That opened my heart up to the potential of reconciliation between somebody I thought, people that I thought were the enemy. And then the second thing that happened after my heart opened up to the potential of change was that I began actually for the first time in my life, it's really important, I began studying Islam. The majority of activists within Islamist organizations come from secular, liberal backgrounds, technicians, engineers and doctors, not theologians, and have never studied Islam. And I fit that category. I came from a secular liberal upbringing. I had never studied Islam. So for the first time in my life, after having learned Arabic, because I studied law and Arabic at university, I started studying Islam from its original sources, and I realized something. And that was that what I believed was my faith was, in fact, a product of European fascism that emerged after World War I. And the ideas traveled from Europe into the Middle East through communism, because socialism was adopted as a form of resistance against colonialism, against the colonial powers. And so it was the ideal, aligning with the USSR was the ideal form of resistance against Western governments that colonized Muslim-majority countries. And those ideas then, when their appeal didn't sit well with Muslims of faith, because communism is essentially about materialism and godless notions of man emerging from matter, they had to adopt the same political paradigms but make them compatible with Islam. And Islamism emerged through the 1920s through to the 50s. And then I realized that traditionally Islam is entirely bereft of any reference to Islamist paradigms, such as the Islamic State. The word state doesn't even exist in the Quran or the Hadith collections. Nor does the word sovereignty, we used to say sovereignty belongs to God. Or constitution, we used to argue that a state that does not have an Islamic constitution is invalid. Nor does the word, as I said, state or laws or legislation. None of these words exist in the Quran or Hadith collection whatsoever. I'm talking entirely absent, not even once, as I mentioned. What is mentioned is the word Sharia, which is a personal code of conduct, a personal religious code. What is mentioned is authority. And what I realized was the authorities that existed throughout the medieval period were temporal authorities that never once adopted the Sharia as state law, except for a brief period in Spain, in Islamic Spain. And the Ottomans began to try it in response, again, to modernity, not because of Islam. They began adopting a constitution in an effort they called it the Majalla. And it was an effort from Tanzimat reforms. And they adopted what they called the Majalla, which was an effort to take the Hanafi school of Islamic jurisprudence to make it compatible with state law. And they failed in that effort, and they stopped in that process, and soon after the Ottoman Empire collapsed anyway. And the reason they did that was because they found European states had progressed after establishing the rule of law, constitutions, and these very modern political ideals. They tried to imitate Europe in this regard, but it still failed anyway. So it's in fact, Islamism is actually a result of modernity. I realized that in prison, so when I came back to the UK, soon after coming back and working with HT, I realized that I could no longer continue. I left HT. I renounced my membership of the organization, but also the Islamist ideology and the principles that I advocated for so long, 13 years of my life. And then with Ed Hussein, set up the Quilliam Foundation. Those of you who read his book, it's slightly out of date because the last chapter, don't get scared, because it ends with me still being a member of HT. But things have moved on since then. Because that was written in 2000, that was published, sorry, in 2006. Yeah, because I left in May 2007. So it was, that's right. Within a week of being published or so, I left HT.
What were the consequences of you leaving?
The consequences were both personal and they affected HT directly, because because it was a big blow to them. The personal are that you're not recording this, are you?